Hello, welcome. I'm Susie. This is my podcast. If you're coming back, welcome back. So glad to see you. And if you are new here, welcome. Also glad to see you. You might want to go back and listen to the first two parts of this series. The first one, in which I discuss rights as just a general concept of understanding, and in part two, in which I discuss the idea of rights within the framework of power and the idea of winning in America. And in part three, I'm going to talk a little bit about the principles of fear. All of these things connect together in a really subtle way, but in really powerful ways. So I have a lot of thoughts about it, and I'd love to share them with you. Stick around. So, we understand that the concepts of universal rights within a framework of class based sociological foundations are destined to conflict. So, I want to talk a little bit about, what are the origins of those conflicts and what are the successful strategies that address them equitably? Now, I don't claim to have the answers, just talking here. But I think through the talking, we come to a greater understanding of the potential pathways in which we all feel heard and seen and represented. That's, hard to accomplish, as I think we all know. So I keep talking about fear. Why? Why do I keep talking about fear? Gosh, what are you so afraid of? Well, nothing. I mean, I'm afraid of lots of things, but I think fear is it's commonly understood to be a really basic part of our emotional makeup. If you've ever seen the Pixar film Inside Out, which is a really beautiful and sad and funny and poignant capture of what goes on inside the mind of a child through their development, the principal emotions are joy, anger, sadness, and fear. These are the core sort of building blocks from which we build our more nuanced understandings of the world as our brain and our cognitive pathways continue to develop, and we absorb more stimulus that helps us build a framework of our understanding of the world inside our brains. That's how we develop knowledge. It's a self-referential system. Epistemologically, again, we build ideas through the culmination of interpretation of stimulatory input. I know that sounds cold and clinical, but it's helpful to think about it in those terms because it's easy to just sort of imagine that thoughts kind of spring up magically like pixie dust in your brain, but there are processes that are originating those thoughts, that are communicating things to you, that are communicating things to the world. And I think that it's a good idea to sort of examine that and understand it because there's a lot of baggage there. Fear is an automatic response to a perceived threat of one's security. We all, again, know and understand that to be true. Fear is the fear of the unknown, fear of physical attack, fear of, insecurity in economic resources. There's, fear drives us in a lot of ways to seek protective conditions that ensure our survival. It's basic, it's instinctual, it's like gut level DNA stuff. It also drives societal thinking as well. There are any number of examples throughout history and throughout American history where fear has been the driving force of some part of our development. For example, and primarily, the American Revolution was born of a fear of losing liberty. It was born of a fear of tyranny. It was born of the fear of economic insecurity at the hands of another person whose power obliterated yours in that dynamic. There was no equity there at all. And the folks that began the revolution said, we've got the advantage of this ocean between us. Let's assert a different idea of power here. And it was a big deal and it was extremely difficult. And there was a war of this, fledgling nation, and we won. And that's crazy, you guys. But we did it. We did it. We won. We started. It's good news. Subsequently, but in that same vein, as the nascent American political system took form, there was immediately a schism in thinking about the pathway that the governance should take, that our political ideology should take. And it resulted primarily in the two-party system being formed in, at that time, federalism versus republicanism. The idea that the federal government, was big enough, large enough to support and should support the basic needs of the people on like a more existential level. But republicanism felt that the federal government really should just sort of be a loosely formed, coalition of independent states, and that the states themselves should have more direct rights over their communities. And those two concepts over the course of human history, American history, have, there's been a very healthy back and forth of those concepts, of the ideas. They've both evolved over time and have become different, but they under different names, under different banners. But the concepts basically stay very much the same. I'll talk a little bit more about sort of political division in a future episode. But again, the division in the political systems is a really good example of the manifestation of formulation of politics through fear. John Adams, who was a huge proponent of federalism, felt pretty strongly that the presidency, while not monarchic, should reflect monarchic qualities. Jefferson had an intense fear of that. It was the main reason for him that they were doing this whole thing. Like, he didn't want to be told by a large governing body, and in particular, not by a president or a king, God forbid, what he could do with his property, with his money. He did not want to be told what to do. He believed that it was his manifest destiny to do that for himself and to help the people in his community. So those two ideas, are really have some basic conflict that obviously still exists to this day. And I think both have significant merit. I think both parties should exist and there should be some balance there. It obviously runs afoul of all sorts of societal baggage. Another obvious example of fear in the course of American history driving our political lives is the Civil War. The Civil War, there is no arguing, was a war about slavery. It is also true to say that it was a war about economic security. Southern states feared economic ruin in the wake of humanist ideas, right? The idea of thinking about their property as people completely changed the way that they could do business. And they were doing business, and business was good. These were a lot of wealthy elites that had huge tracts of land, massive farms and plantations, and all of their work, all of their labor was completely free to them by virtue of the fact that they bought that person as property now. You get all the milk for free. That's what slavery was. So they saw that again. They didn't see these people as people. They saw them as property, and therefore the fear of losing their property is what drove them to secession. And that is what caused the Civil War. So fear, right there, powerful driver of the epistemological notion of human beings, not as human beings, but as, easily tradable commodities. Holy shit. And then, in that same note, in that same lane, the Jim Crow era being a response by the losing side to reaffirm some of their power by subverting federal laws relating to the rights of these newly made citizens. And then in response to that, the civil rights movement, having had enough of their bullshit and operating out of the fear for their lives, which, this is an important distinction, I think, that needs to be made. Okay, racists feel like, current day and history, like their rights are being infringed upon because their property is being manipulated or, taken against them, right? Like their power is being taken out from under them. But, on the other side of that is a person who's the losing part of this equation for them is death. But in some cases, that's the best possible outcome, right? Because you could also be subject to like rape and having be forced to, have children and then having those children ripped away from you and taken away, or, being whipped or being chased by dogs, or on and on and on, right? So there's a false equivalency in the notion of preserving an economic right and preserving the right to life. That's, again, I think that's an important distinction that to keep in mind. So, okay, fear. It's prominent in our lives, individually, systemically, institutionally. But what happens when fear functions in a vacuum, right? Like, fear is a thing that we all have. It's a natural response mechanism. It's biologically ingrained in us. We also have, a layer of rationality though that is able to mitigate the sensory input of the fear inducing things with a sensibility of, okay, how real is this fear? Does it represent existential fear? Am I in fear for my life? Or is this just like, I'm afraid of change? Like we have that ability to, a barometer, if you will, to sort of measure those things. But what if our barometer is broken? Like, what if our inability to understand the real threat is manipulated somehow, right? Like, I'd say, I'd argue that like the current state, and this is not unique to our times. Let's just be clear, but it is manifesting itself differently. The corrosion of like an agreed upon set of facts, which that becomes deeply problematic. Like you can't have a conversation, like if you don't understand Swahili, you can't have a conversation with a Swahili speaking person who doesn't speak your language. I mean, you can try, like you can gesticulate and you can draw pictures and, but in general, like that conversation it's just not going to happen in like a meaningful, way without a long time, I guess. It's possible. I don't know. Just for the naysayers out there. Point being, a conversation with someone who doesn't speak your language, by extension, a conversation with someone with whom you cannot agree that a square is a square, is going nowhere. And that is, I think, kind of at the core of some of the difficulty we find, right now. There's a lot of reasons for that happening in America right now. I submit that one of them was the abandonment in 1987 of the Fairness Doctrine, which it wasn't like a law, but it was sort of a guideline or a policy that the FEC would enforce that required equal airtime to both sides. It brought in the early 90s, I don't know, for those of you who remember, it brought in the age of the ombudsman, right? Like there everybody for like a hot minute, like everybody had an ombudsman who was there to weigh and judge. And, we started to hear fair and balanced a lot. And so much so that the then Fox News, the fledgling Fox News, which, was really a recipient of the bounty of riches that were in the wake of the abandonment of the Fairness Doctrine. Fox News was all about fair and balanced. That didn't last long. So it's not a new idea. Propaganda is not new. It's been around for forever, and for a very good reason, right? When you control the narrative, you control the outcome. So propaganda is a good tool in which a media outlet can frame a narrative for its audience without deference to having to verify its sources or demonstrate those sources or support its arguments. It can exclude whatever content, it wants to if it doesn't, suit their narrative. There's a lot of ways to skin that cat now. And it also birthed an entire ecosphere. Actually, I actually think the reverse is true. I think that the ecosphere itself is what birthed Fox News ultimately, because that was the birth of the radio jocks, those guys, the talk radio guys, the Rush Limbaughs and those guys. Like, I think they kind of came on the scene first because they were sick to death of the fairness doctrine, and really wanted, and it wasn't the same on radio. So they kind of say what they wanted to, and really gained an audience. There was a market for it, and then that's how things started to roll. And obviously, right wing conservatism, and when I say right wing conservatism, I mean like deep right wing conservatism, really saw the advantages there and began to hone in on those mechanisms for their messaging. And it's been super effective. It's been frighteningly effective. So that's still a story that's unfolding before our eyes. I'm interested to see where it goes. I think that there's some examples in American history that illuminate the how these kind of disparate understandings of quote objective reality are. There's flashpoints in our history that kind of show these two things. The examples that come to mind most immediately are the JFK assassination as the first one, because many of you who are, I don't know, over 30 probably, have a historical understanding of just the significance of that assassination and the fact that the investigation was so weird, and the fact that the Warren Commission was so weak, and the fact that they took the whole of their findings and the documents and put it in a vault for like 80 years or some nonsense. And there's all these questions about it that their findings just don't make sense, and it's birthed this entire like conspiracy universe of like who killed JFK, like who was Castro, it was the mafia, it was the CIA, right? Like we're still talking about it, like Oliver Stone's still talking about it. But that's consequential, right? Because it indicates, first of all, it was the assassination of American president, wasn't new. It had happened before. The assassination of the president was, of Kennedy, was one of the first moments in which we saw a state narrative that began to differ from people's understanding of the evidence before their eyes, and yet they'd never been in a position to question the state. So why would they now, right? But there was that tension. It did exist, and particularly leading into the anti-war movement in Vietnam, right? It was like, oh shit, like Kennedy didn't want us to be here and he was going to get us out, and now hey, look who we are. I mean, again, Oliver Stone he says a lot about this in a lot of his work. But the military industrial complex sort of being a major feature of why Kennedy was not popular in the institutions at that time, and why his absence would have been favorable for them. So there again, you see this, kind of two competing narratives and a fear because the president was shot. Like at that time, really any time, but particularly at that time, the presidency was a lot more sacrosanct than it is now, and it was, these people who are alive at that time still tell you they know exactly where they were. It's like a 9/11 moment. Nixon and Watergate, like again, those competing narratives of the president had this treasure trove of like illicit information, people confessing crimes, planning the cover up to those crimes, audio recordings, documents, enemies lists, etc., all kept very tightly guarded. And yet the information that was coming out of his face, to the American people, very much belied the, kind of authoritarian qualities of Nixon's, leadership. And that moment was the death of the political innocence of that generation. And, there was a lot of argument about, how dare you question the government? Like they told you X was Y. And Nixon really kind of bore out the, particularly young people's frustrations about being lied to. They just, this is supposed to be a democracy. Like the democracy relies upon an educated electorate. If you can't tell us what you're doing, we can't make informed decisions about whether or not we support it, right? Like that was a fundamental conversation at that time, and people were not having it, because if you were against the war, then you were anti-American, friend. Tricky. Clinton, Lewinsky, Ken Starr, that whole mess. There's a lot. I think we see a nice crystallization there between the competing narratives of liberals and conservatives. But that that one is very 90s unique. Like that was a very 90s scandal, and just the whole thing. But again, fear of getting caught, fear of losing that dynastic power that he was, trying to achieve. And Ken Starr, like fear of, toiling in obscurity. Like Ken Starr was just, eager for the spotlight and really hoping to, nail somebody to the wall. Tough Ken Starr. Donald Trump and the 2020 election. Another, I think, very stark example, and current example of that corrosion of an agreed upon set of facts. I don't want to talk about that in detail, in part because I'm sure you've heard a lot about it and you have thoughts of your own. My thoughts are messy and very emotionally charged right now. So, I got to take some time with that and like work through it before, sharing it. But okay, so here are a handful of examples that sort of illuminate, how those flashpoint moments affect culture and affect our trust of our institutions, right? Like our belief in the authority, quote unquote, like who's the information authority, like who do we believe, who do we not believe, who do we think is honest, who do we not think is honest at all, features in our election calculus. And we no longer are required to create a truly balanced or objective reportage, right? Like we're free to just opine all the day long, regardless of whether you're coming from a liberal viewpoint or a conservative viewpoint. You don't need to represent, both sides of an item. Hopefully, and I think a lot of, news outlets continue to do just that. Like journalistic integrity is still alive and well in America. I believe it's to be so. And I think that journalistic integrity in its purest form does represent a complete and kind of in totality representation of facts that comprise a specific issue, and it doesn't necessarily ascribe value to those facts. It merely presents the facts to you as they are understood, and they may be couched within a lot of contextual sort of like value judgment types of ideas, but that again, the issues when done at their best are, I think, presented in a way that connects those dots and makes it clear what's at stake and leaves it to you to make the decision about how you want your life to be led, or how you want your life to be restricted, or etc. I think in addition to corroding the ability to dialogue, this lack of agreement on an agreed upon reality, it enables the problem of confirmation bias and other unconscious biases, which are, hey, they're unconscious, like no one's to blame, right, for having unconscious ideas. Like it's part of our programming, it's part of our epistemological processes. So a lack of acknowledgement and a lack of awareness of those biases is wildly problematic because it does lead to decision making. So confirmation bias in specific and the siloing of news is a recipe for just a alchemical ignorance combined with fear, particularly if the sources of information that you're predominantly participating in use fear as a means of motivating. Like, it's low. It's just like, the appealing to people's fear is very effective. It's how you win, right? It's how you win. You make people afraid enough and then convince them that you're the person who can fix it. It's a page in every playbook of every dictator throughout history. And it's a very effective tool. You don't want to hear bad news, and hey, now you don't have to. You can just go to whatever your preferred echo chamber is and sit comfortably in the notion that everybody thinks just like you. Thank goodness, all the good people at any rate. Everybody else, And, fear, let's just be honest, fear, more often than not, the emotion that is triggered by fear is anger. And once you're in anger, in many ways, all bets are off. Examples of that include January 6th, 2021 in Washington, D.C., and the storming of the Capitol, the riots in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and what transpired in the wake of that. Going further back, the LA riots in the wake of the Rodney King beating and the acquittal of all the cops that were guilty of viciously brutalizing that man for way, way, way too long. Like any time would have been too long, but it was too long, y'all. It triggered fear, it triggered anger, it triggered violence, all of these things. And I think a question that I have is, where does the perception of more rights for them means less rights for me come from? And I would argue that, at least in part, it comes from capitalism and the idea of the consequences of iniquities in wealth distribution and in the wide disparities in the distribution of power, right? Not just like fiscal or, economic iniquities, but in the distribution of agency and the distribution of influence over policy and over law. Where does that come from? Like where does it where is it written that there has to be more for one and less for another? Because again, if you think of rights as being something inalienable, right? It's on board, it's innate, built in, regardless of where it comes from. It's something we all have. Then why is yours bigger or more important or more powerful or more legitimate than theirs? And if the manifestation of, or the agency that you manifest in the assertion of your rights infringes upon their rights, what then? What do you do? What do you do? What is the conflict resolution tool that you're going to engage? Is it a political one? Is it an emotional one? I think these are good questions to ask. For me, how do you address fear? There's only one way to address fear for me, and it's through love. It's love, translated into meaningful understanding and meaningful action, trying to get at the motivations behind what's driving a person to, and especially to understand that what are you afraid of? Like what's scaring you that you feel like these are the choices, regardless of their impact to other people, even to yourself, perhaps to some extent, because there's a lot of different examples of people making choices that arguably are, not in their own interests because it's the one that their party supports. And that is always a confusing maneuver to me unless you look at it through the mechanism of power and winning. And an almost like self-delusory position of, if the people who agree with me on these things are in power, then that is automatically going to confer the rights that I desire upon me, and the access to all the things that I desire is going to be smoothed over, and I won't have to compete for others, for it with others whose rights don't reflect the importance or the primacy of my own. It's small. It's a small way of thinking, I think, and easy to do because, again, we're all trapped within the vacuum of our own consciousness. We can fight it, we can resist it, we can think outside of ourselves, have that intellectual capability, and we've been in space. Like, human beings have been floating around up there looking at this little blue marble. We've been up there. Perspective like that should not be wasted. I find that, like, a lot of time when I'm looking at conflicts and in dialogue between parties relating to rights, that those parties are reacting to the same issues, but they're identifying different sources and different solutions, and that those sources and the solutions both are seen through the lens of their lived experiences. And those lived experiences can diverge in a multitude of ways, which then translate into a different understanding of rights. That sounds complicated, but the bottom line is, right, like, if you can see commonality in the assertion of another person's rights, and you can see it not as a threat, as some sort of an infringement of rights of your own, but rather as an effort to just be in the world without fear of being marginalized, without fear of being alienated, without fear of death, then wow, that's progress. That's a really good way to bring society forward to a shared understanding of rights, and equal rights in particular. I don't think there's a single person in the world, particularly in the United States, that you could talk to and be like, are you against equal rights? A person is going to be like, hell yeah, equal rights suck. That's actually probably not true. There's probably a huge section of people that won't, but nobody I'm interested in talking about. I find those people difficult to take seriously. Be that as it may, most, free thinking and intelligent people will agree that equal rights is a good thing and we should aspire to that, but we should be honest in our aspirations, and we should acknowledge that our place in the culture isn't the only place in the culture, that it represents a spectrum and that that spectrum is gorgeous and it enriches us in so many ways. Embrace that and, let's move forward in the spirit of, freedom for everybody, right? And let's figure it out how, where those iniquities really are, not driven through fear, but driven through the practical realities of our lives. It's hard to do, but it's worth it. Well, that about does it for this series on the idea of rights. And I really, really hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it. I appreciate you. Thank you. I hope you'll come back and join me again in my next episode. I'm not totally sure what it's going to be yet, but I'm toying around with the idea of diving into gender as a concept. So I hope you'll pop in, see what's cooking. Until then.